All right, today we pick up with the Red Scare and McCarthyism. What's happening in this time period after World War II is that there is this fear of internal communist subversion, that the communist idea is going to spread in our own country. And because that's how communism does spread. It begins with the people in the country, and then it grows to a point where it takes over the government. And so our government, our people are very, very concerned about this. So in 1947, the Federal Loyalty Review Program is put together. And the purpose of this program is to find out if people are loyal to the United States or not. And so their job is to find any disloyalty to the U.S. government. About 4.7 million people will be investigated, and somewhere between 350 and 500 are fired because they were considered to be a security risk, that there was just something in their background or in their beliefs that called into question whether or not they were truly loyal to the United States. Another 2,500 people are going to actually quit their job because they felt that their political association shouldn't even be questioned. They don't feel like that's something that the government should be able to do. And according to our Constitution, it isn't. You're able to believe in what you want to believe. So, in 1947, again, the Attorney General's list is going to be created. And the Attorney General is going to put together this list of subversive organizations, organizations that seem to or outwardly promote communism. So some of them, it's just like they seem like they do, or maybe they have communist tendencies. But this list is going to, it doesn't really make a distinction between sort of like communism versus all-out, full-blown communism. It just includes all these different groups. So it included things like the Civil Rights Congress, it included the Veterans Against Discrimination group, and groups like the League of American Writers. So there's a lot of different groups that are included in that. The Attorney General will also at this point create what's now known as the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And J. Edgar Hoover is going to be put in charge of investigations. The FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, is meant to search for insubordination and subversiveness within our own government, within our own country. The CIA works differently. They look outside of our country. They're focusing on foreign countries. So the FBI, that's its job. And J. Edgar Hoover's in charge of it. And he's very determined to do a good job of this task that's given to him. Well, there's a couple cases that are going to come up that really exemplify this second Red Scare that comes across the United States. This first case is the case in 1948 of Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss. And what happens in this is Chambers is going to be accused of subversion. He was the editor of Time magazine, publication that's still around today, and he was accused of spying for the Soviet Union. And he claims that Alger Hiss, was one of his informants. And Hiss is going to deny this left and right. In fact, Hiss is going to go to jail for perjury. And perjury is where you lie under oath. And he maintained throughout his trial and throughout his imprisonment that the FBI had framed him, that they set him up to be the fall guy for this. And there's some evidence to suggest that it was sort of seemed like a frame job. It sort of seems like it was a setup. Because here's the evidence that really puts him into jail is a group of papers called the Pumpkin Papers. Now these Pumpkin Papers was this group of microfilm, which is like, you guys have probably never ever seen this before, but it's like photograph film with pictures of documents on it, and you would put it into this machine that blows it up so you can read it, kind of thing. Technology today doesn't even compare to the it's like dinosaur newspaper search kind of thing. Anyway, so you've got this microfilm that had important documents on it, and it was being left in Chambers's garden inside a carved out pumpkin. And so he would go out and pick up the information. Evidence is going to be found there, and Chambers said, well, I knew Alger Hiss was going to be planting it there on such and such date, and sure enough, on that date, that information was was put in there. There was microfilm put in there. So there's no real evidence, putting Alger Hiss at the scene other than the confession of Whittaker Chambers, who's just looking for someone to go down with him kind of thing, that it's not just his fault. But there's also evidence that's going to go back and forth on whether or not Alger Hiss is guilty or not. The documents, all the microfilm documents, are typed on the same typewriter that was possessed by Alger Hiss, and we know this because it matched previous documents that were known to have been written by him. But in Hiss's defense, his typewriter was sold in 1937, and there was no document that could be found that could be dated after 1937 that was known to be his. So it could have been somebody else that was doing this. So, like I said, there's evidence to go both ways on this. I don't know if we'll ever know the truth. In 1953, a second case comes up that's going to deal with the Second Red Scare and this fear of communism. And this one's going to involve Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And what happens in this case is Klaus Fuchs, who is a Soviet spy, is going to be captured, and he's going to admit that he had passed along information about the atomic bomb to a man named David Greenglass. And David Greenglass was an American citizen who was working with the atomic bomb research on the Manhattan Project. And he says that David Greenglass says that he was recruited by his sister Ethel Rosenberg and her husband Julius, and so that they were involved in it as well. So those two, Julius and Ethel, are going to be put on trial or brought to trial, and there's a lot of inconclusive evidence again on whether or not they actually were a part of the spy ring. The FBI is going to pressure Julius, saying, we're going to indict your wife, and both you and your wife are going to go to jail, and you'll never see your children again. They had two small boys, and you're never going to see your children again. But so they were pressuring him with the indictment of his wife, but she calls their bluff and never admits to anything. And they weren't really going to indict her because they didn't have any evidence against her to put her into jail, and they lacked the evidence to pull a case together, so they exaggerated what they did have and made it seem like it was really more important than what it really was. So they are put on trial, they'll be convicted, and they'll be executed for their crimes. And they're the first Americans to be executed for treason in the United States. At the time of their execution, Julius does die immediately. It is a death by electric chair, and he dies immediately. But Ethel, because she was a smaller woman, had to take 3 charges. So they electrocuted her 3 times because the chair was made for a man and she was a petite woman, and so things didn't connect the way they did. So she was like unduly tortured and then executed. What makes this case really interesting is that in 2001, David Greenglass, the brother of Ethel, confessed in an interview in 2001 that he lied, that he completely made up the whole story in order to save himself and his family. But he also said in the interview that he had no regrets about sacrificing his sister and her husband because it saved him and his family. Now, like I said, they did have 2 children. They had 2 sons. No one in the family would adopt them after their parents were executed, but they were finally adopted by the Maripol family a lot later on. Both sons have tried throughout the past few years to exonerate their parents, until 2008, when new information became available and forensic science and stuff, helps out with evidence. And what the new evidence in 2008 kind of suggested was that the father, Julius, was most likely involved, but that the Soviets really learned nothing from what information he gave them because it was nothing really that important. But that their mother knew about it but was not involved, so she wasn't an active part. So for both of their crimes, if they were put on trial by today's standards, they would never have deserved the death penalty because the information they did give up was so insignificant that it didn't affect anything. So those are just 2 cases that kind of exemplify what the FBI was up to during the Second Red Scare. Another organization that's going to be created to deal with the communist threat in the United States is the House Un-American Activities Committee, or HUAC. And HUAC will be around from 1945 to 1953, and it's one of several organizations that's going to be founded really in the 30s, but really comes into its prime in the 1940s and 50s, and it goes after those that are in government especially. But then it's going to change its focus to Hollywood because of the power of the media and the influence that it can have over people. And they felt that films that were coming out of Hollywood were not patriotic enough, that some of them just seemed to have a little bit too much communist tendencies and a little too much communist leanings to really be comfortable for American public to see, because we can be influenced by that, and they didn't like that. So a famous group that's going to come under the HUAC scrutiny is the Hollywood 10. And this is a group of screenwriters and directors who protest what HUAC was doing. That they say that HUAC didn't have the right to ask these questions. And they're going to use the First Amendment as their basis, that you have the freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom of petition, and all freedom of assembly, all that kind of stuff. However, most of them are going to be found guilty and jailed for various times. What is kind of a horrible side effect of this is that many studios are going to begin to blacklist people in Hollywood. And when you're blacklisted, it meant that the studios would not hire you. So they wouldn't hire you if you had communist leanings or if you were labeled as a communist. And so for a lot of actors and directors and screenwriters and even just the stage staff, all those stage crew, all that kind of stuff, it was very hard to get some jobs. And a lot of them actually are going to start changing their names in order so that they can't be tracked. In Hollywood, you're going to find two different kinds of groups developing. The first are called friendly witnesses. And friendly witnesses were people who were questioned by HUAC or by other organizations like the FBI. And in the course of their questioning, they're being told, well, if you give us the names of other people you've seen at the meetings, we'll let you go free. And so these friendly witnesses were people who were questioned, but they were let free because they gave up the names of others who they had witnessed at meetings or at different organizations, or who they had heard were a part of it. The other group are called the Fifth Amendment communists, because some people learned from the Hollywood 10 that, pleading the First Amendment doesn't work. And so they plead the Fifth, which means that you don't have to testify against yourself. So if you are asked, do you belong to a communist organization, you can say, I plead the Fifth. I refuse the right to, I refuse to answer that question. But what happens is that when you do that, the assumption is you are communist. So you may not actually come out and say you're a communist, but the assumption is that you are one. So you're going to be labeled one anyway. So I love to bring up these two classic examples of what happened in Hollywood in the 1940s and 50s during the second Red Scare. And these two men, Dalton Trumbo and Elia Kazan. And Dalton Trumbo was a screenwriter. He wrote a book called Johnny Get Your Gun, which was an anti-war book about World War I, and it tells the story of young Johnny who goes to war and gets basically blown to pieces. He's stuck in a hospital bed for the rest of his life. He has no arms, no legs. He can't talk. He has no. He can't see. He's kind of trapped in his own little world in his mind. But he's not dead. He is still living. And so it really highlights the damages that war can do to people and how it can affect not only your physical health, but your mental health as well. Well, Dalton Trumbo is going to be blacklisted because some of the organizations, like anti-war organizations, were considered to be somewhat communist. Not patriotic, that's for sure. And so he is going to be blacklisted. And he actually is going to have the second guy, Elia Kazan, who was a director, is going to be the one that gives up Dalton Trumbo's name. Anyway, so Elia Kazan is a director. He directs things like On the Waterfront, which is about it's basically a boxing movie, a guy getting out of the ghettos and making a name for himself. He wins many Oscars for a lot of his works. He's got multiple Oscars for his work. He directed On the Waterfront. He directed A Streetcar Named Desire, a lot of different things. And in 1999, he won the Academy Award for Lifetime Achievement. And he was a friendly witness. He was someone who gave up other people's names in order for him to be let free. And so when he won this Academy Award for Lifetime Achievement in 1999, there is a bunch of mixed reactions from the crowd. And you're going to see this in class tomorrow. We're going to look at it, and you're going to see that some of the crowd is up and clapping, giving him a standing ovation like they do whenever somebody wins a lifetime achievement, and the other half of the crowd is just sitting there and refusing to even acknowledge it. And so even today in Hollywood, there are lots of people who still hold grudges because of what people like the friendly witnesses did. They sacrificed other people's careers in order to be let loose themselves. And so they felt that he didn't really deserve this award because he was a friendly witness and gave up other people's names, and other people's careers suffered as a result. Like Dalton Trumbo's career is going to suffer as a result. He's going to move to Mexico. Dalton Trumbo will move to Mexico and change his name. And he changes his name, and he still does screenplays. He writes screenplays, but under a different name. And in fact, he writes the screenplay for Spartacus. And it won't be until after his death that he is acknowledged as the author or the screenwriter for the movie Spartacus. So that's what the situation is like in Hollywood. Other things that are going on at this time, lots of anti-communist stuff. We got the McCarran Act in 1950. It's called the Internal Security Act as well, but it's supported by Richard Nixon and Senator McCarran and Hubert Humphrey. And what this does is it requires the registration of all communist organizations to register with the government. Basically, the government wants to know who are your members, how many do you have, how much money do you have, where are you located, where are your members located, all this kind of stuff. So it's a compilation of records of who are the communists in our country, sort of thing, so we can keep an eye on them, sort of thing. So all of this is going to kind of culminate in 1950 to 1954 with McCarthyism. And McCarthyism comes with Senator Joseph McCarthy, who was a Republican senator from Wisconsin. He was a World War II hero, even though he lied about his service. He made up a story about his war wound that he received. He got one not serving active duty. He publicized this huge letter of commendation that he got for his service, although he wrote it himself. He didn't actually get a letter of commendation. But basically, McCarthy's kind of a nobody until 1950. He was a kind of a minor senator, not really that important, but in 1950 he's up for re-election. And so he needs an issue to help him get re-elected. He's a very good speaker, even though he's not very well liked by his fellow senators. So he is on this re-election campaign, trying to garner up some support, and he's in Wheeling, West Virginia, speaking at a Republican Women's Club conference or meeting. And what he does is he goes in front of this bunch of ladies, and he basically sets his suitcase down, briefcase, and he pulls out a sheaf of papers, and he says, "I have here in my hand a list of 205 names of subversives serving in your state government. What would you like me to do about this?" And so basically, everywhere he goes, he pulls out another sheaf of paper, and the numbers change depending on where he's speaking. But he's basically saying, I know of these people who are subversive working in your government. And if you want me to get rid of them, I need to be in office in order to do this. I need to be reelected as senator. And he's continually changing his facts, changing his figures, and people are going to call him out and say, no, there's not that many, and that kind of stuff. And he's going to discredit his critics and opponents by calling them communist or communist sympathizers. You know, why would you be protecting them? That kind of stuff. So he calls them into question. So he kind of just really makes a lot of people upset with him as that goes on. But he does get reelected, and the end of McCarthyism is going to come in 1954, because even after he gets elected, he's got all this. He's got to continue now, right? He's got to continue targeting people, and he's going to accuse President Eisenhower and the U.S. Army of sheltering communists. Now, it's one thing to pick on people in the state governments or local government level. It's a whole different can of worms when you accuse the president and the U.S. Army. And so the Republican Party at that point says, abandon ship. And so they basically say, you're on your own, buddy. You have made your bed. Now you need to lie in it, sort of thing. And so there's this huge trial. And McCarthy is going to be shamed in front of the public because they finally figure out that he pretty much made up the whole thing, that there was no truth to it at all. McCarthy will retire, and then he dies in 1957 from alcoholism, and the age of McCarthyism is put to rest, literally.